On behalf of CEPR, let me welcome you to this first of a webinar series. It's really a pleasure to have such a distinguished and large audience with us. And this is clearly a tribute both to the topic that we are dealing with and to the speakers, to the very distinguished speakers we have on this panel. Let me just say also that it is the first in a series of CEPR and LSE with the School of Public Policy, LSE, that we want to be doing over the next few weeks on the broad questions of the world in times of COVID. It's going to be topics that have to do with emerging markets, with lower income countries, and with the global topics, as this one here is of particular relevance, namely a proposal on a debt standstill.
Thank you, Beatrice, and very welcome. So I'm Erik Bergdorf. I'm the director of the Institute of Global Affairs at the LSE School of Public Policy. We are doing this as a joint between IGA and School of Public Policy. What I thought might be useful, we have a very big audience, and many of the people are very familiar with the specifics of the debt standstill and so on. But I think it's useful still to put this in a slightly broader perspective. We are talking about a global crisis of unprecedented scale and also unusually urgent to get funding out to different parts of the world. And we should remember that it's a medical and an economic crisis. And we need a global response. And that global response has started with important swap lines from central banks, and they're providing immediate liquidity to individual countries. There's been an unprecedented response, I would say, from the IMF and the multilateral development banks, but we will need much more. And this is where I think this discussion of debt standstills and possible debt relief comes into the discussion. We just don't have enough resources to put up behind these international financial institutions and to provide enough funding to meet the financing needs of these countries. So we will need to find ways of getting debt standstills, possible debt relief. That has happened now through the G20 agreement of the finance ministers met just before the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank and agreed to a standstill on the bilateral part. But of course, what's still out there is the issue of the private or non-official creditors and the multilateral creditors as well. And we probably come up at some point with that issue as well today. So it will become a technical discussion today, and the details are extremely important, but it's also important to understand the broader context. So over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you, Erik. Yes, let's go into the details and into, in particular, the presentation of a concrete proposal. What we are going to be discussing and presenting is being published as a CEPR Policy Insight, born out of necessity, is the headline, and it's Policy Insight number 103. For those of you who have not found it or read it, it is available for free. As Erik was saying, the G20 has already decided on a standstill for either countries. The participation of the private sector on equal terms was announced, but has not been operationalized. So in principle, it is really easy to imagine that investors as a group, private investors as a group, who are owed money by lower income countries may have reasons to be generous. As Reuters put it, a freeze might avert a worse chill. But what is true collectively may not be true privately. So in practice, the incentives, of course, to free ride for individual investors, both on the official sector but also among each other, is large, or put differently, this is a large collective action problem. So how to organize this? In a nutshell, the proposal that we put forward is that countries redirect suspended payments by the private sector, but also the official sector, into a credit facility, and ensure that this money is only used for pandemic purposes. The World Bank or a similar organization would administer this facility, the CCL, this credit facility. And to assist debtor countries in any legal challenges to this arrangement, we suggest that the G20 or other official sector body acknowledge that the COVID situation creates a so-called state of necessity for the afflicted countries. This is a principle in international law, as will be explained by our lawyers, and which does allow nations to suspend normal performance of contracts temporarily during exceptional circumstances, and there is no question that we are living in exceptional circumstances. So after this, let me introduce our panel. We have with us 4 co-authors, in addition to myself, who will not be intervening except for asking questions on this proposal. So we have Patrick Bolton, Professor of Columbian Imperial College in London, Lee Buchheit, one of the masterminds of debt restructuring, sovereign debt restructuring, and involved in over many years. Mitu Gulati, again, one of the masterminds of sovereign debt restructuring and Professor of Law at Duke, and Ugo Panizza, Professor at the Graduate Institute in Geneva and a CEPR Vice President. So I will hand over now to Patrick for sharing a few slides on presenting the proposal and this group to discuss it. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beatrice. I would like to start by thanking the CEPR and the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics for hosting this webinar. This is a very useful way of reaching out to the broader world at a time when everyone is confined and where not everyone has time to keep up with all the writing that's coming out. I would like to thank all the hundreds of people who signed up for this seminar, and I hope this will be useful. As Beatrice mentioned, we are going to be 4 co-authors speaking, and we're going to be giving you a small presentation, 10 slides in all, and we're going to divide it up so that we can keep your attention. I will begin with a very brief introduction, and then I will pass the microphone to Ugo Panizza, and then Ugo will pass the microphone on to Mitu Gulati, and Mitu will pass the microphone on to Lee Buchheit. That's how we're going to do our presentation. Okay, so in terms of introduction, let me explain how this initiative happened. It was one of those things where a small email exchange led to something we believe is substantial and an important initiative. And the email exchange was really about taking stock of what was happening out there with the COVID pandemic and telling ourselves, many of us have been following sovereign debt issues and sovereign debt restructuring and debt relief for many years, for decades, telling ourselves, isn't this the perfect example of a situation where debt relief is warranted? And that really speaks to the idea of necessity. So that's how it all started. And then one thing led to another, and I should say that we started thinking about this just shortly before the G20 meeting and shortly before the G20 released its communiqué. And what our proposal is about is really speaking to unfolding events on the policy front. So just to repeat what Eric Bergloff said and what Beatrice said, what is the context? Well, by now we have more than 100 countries seeking IMF help. And a few days ago, there was a very powerful op-ed in the New York Times by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, which I encourage you to read if you haven't seen it yet, where the Prime Minister, let me just quote you one very striking sentence, which is very pertinent to what we are doing here. Let me read it to you. The dilemma Ethiopia faces is stark. Do we continue to pay towards debt or redirect resources to save lives and livelihoods? That is really the issue. Let me now turn to the G20 Communiqué. So this is a very welcome communiqué, a very welcome initiative. And as Beatrice mentioned earlier, it hasn't yet been operationalized, but the principles have been put down on paper and agreed. So let me read to you what the key passages are in the G20 Communiqué. So it says that the G20, and here I'm really quoting from the Communiqué, the G20 supports a time-bound suspension of debt service payments for the poorest countries that request forbearance. The G20 has agreed on a coordinated approach with a common term sheet providing the key features for this debt service suspension initiative, which is also agreed by the Paris Club. All bilateral official creditors will participate in this initiative, consistent with the national laws and internal procedures. The G20 is calling on private creditors working through the Institute of International Finance to participate in the initiative on comparable terms. That is the communiqué, and here I have highlighted the term comparable terms. This is the key issue, and this is the issue that our proposal is addressing. How to do this debt standstill on comparable terms involving all the relevant creditors of a country. With that, let me pass the microphone to Ugo, who will give us a broader context of what is going on out there.
Thank you, Patrick. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes looking at the numbers, and I would like to show two types of numbers. One is about the stock of public debt that developing and emerging market countries owe to external creditors. And here we took all the countries which are classified by the World Bank as not being high income, and we excluded China. China has a large positive external position, so we did not include China. And we divided the countries in three groups. The countries which are classified as upper middle income countries by the World Bank, so this would include countries like Brazil, for instance. Lower middle income countries, this would include countries like probably Kenya, and low income countries, and this would include countries like Ethiopia, which was mentioned by Patrick before. And this is how much they owe, divided in different type of debt. Debt which is short term, debt which is owed to multilateral financial institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, bilateral debt, so debt which is owed to other countries, bond issuances, and these are syndicated bank loans and other type of loans. As you can see, the amounts are large, so it's about 1.8 trillion for upper middle income countries, 1.2 trillion for lower middle income countries. So these two together already make 3 trillion, and lower for low income countries. The G20 Standstill focuses on low income countries plus a couple of countries which are considered by the United Nations as least developed countries, and focuses only on bilateral loans. So the stock of debt on which the G20 Standstill focus, the stock of debt of this country is about $200 billion. But what is interesting, this Standstill focuses on debt which is owed in 2020. This is the full stock of debt. So we also try to estimate numbers for this debt which is owed in the next year, and these are the numbers. There are a lot of columns here, and what I would like to, so we have a division across geographical area: East Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Middle East. But maybe we'll focus again on the same 3 groups we looked at before. These are the upper middle income countries, these are the lower middle income countries, and these are the low income countries. And here there are bars which have dots and bars which are solid. The dots are the interest rate which is due in 2020 according to our estimate, and the solid is the principal which is due. So 2 things here without spending too much time. There is about 120 billion of interest due by upper middle income countries, about 40 billion due by lower middle income countries, and much less by lower income countries. The rest is principal. The numbers again are large. We are just, if we add these 2 columns, we go over 300 billions. Again, this is the G20 action. The G20 action focuses on bilateral debt owed by mostly low-income countries, and it has a value of about 14 billion US dollar. 14 billion is a lot of money, but when we compare this with this type of numbers, we see that there's still a lot of issues that need to be resolved down the road. Some of these issues have to do that the G20 action only focused on bilateral debt, so on this light blue part. So did not focus on private debt, which is what we have in red and orange. And the second that clearly focused on a relatively small group of countries. So, but I let Mitu talk a little bit more about the challenge involved in moving this type of standstill to private creditors, to this big red and orange bar. So Mitu, up to you.
Hi, I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking about the coordination problems that one generally faces in sovereign debt restructurings, and what we have heard from the Institute of International Finance, which is the major creditor organization that in the past has actually performed quite a useful role in prior sovereign debt restructurings in providing coordination. So let's take first the April 9th letter of the Institute of International Finance. It is, from our perspective, quite an optimistic letter that gives one hope. So we have quoted some of the key language there and highlighted the key words that if you are worried about the central problem in sovereign debt workouts and designing something like a standstill, these words should give you hope. So the IIF urges early in the process international coordination among all sets of creditors. So that's key because they can play an important role in coordinating. And as Beatrice said right at the start, our worry is that there will be free rider problems that will destroy the coordination effort. So if the IIF will help in coordination, that's very optimistic. They say that sovereign debtors should avoid discriminating, something that has happened in the past where sovereign debtors have an incentive to divide and conquer. I think they're exactly correct that this won't work if individual debtors try to play games. And from the creditor side, they emphasize the need for burden sharing, sort of equal treatment, as Patrick said on the first slide, comparable treatment. Everybody participates in a coordinated, equal fashion, and then maybe this will work. Now, this was April 9th, 2020, around the time of sort of the G20 response too, which was around the same time. So we had reason for optimism when we were working on our own project. If there could be coordination, we could actually design something. So now let's look at the next slide. The next slide is the second response, the modified response of the IIF. This comes on May 1st, 2020, just a few days ago. And while there was reason for optimism, at least on my part, from the first letter, this second letter is, what is the right word? Right polite word. I'll just say a little bit depressing. And why? This letter emphasizes that creditors should be made to participate only on a voluntary basis. Well, that doesn't sound very coordinated. That sounds like each creditor is going to negotiate its own deal. And in fact, the letter does emphasize it. It says not only will each creditor or creditor subgroup negotiate their own deal, but they'll be making their own calculations of a popular new word, NPV neutrality, meaning they will have their own discount rates, their own interests. And this is, in our view, a recipe for free rider problems going berserk. And if you put this in the context of the fact that the official sector has already, via the G20, committed to provide relief, it creates a situation in which the incentives to free ride on the private sector side are exacerbated even further. Now, hopefully my reading of this second letter from the IIF that seems to be in contrast with the first letter is an incorrect reading. And there will be a clarification that is not at all what they meant, or maybe I have misunderstood. But I will turn it over to Lee to provide hopefully a more optimistic view of what's going to happen, or what could happen.
Thank you, Mitu. Let me summarize the proposal that we have put into the paper that Beatrice mentioned. The objectives that we were trying to achieve were, first, a method of implementing a standstill, both for bilateral creditors and commercial creditors, that could be executed quickly. We're in the middle of a crisis. These countries needed this money last month. They can't wait for the many weeks or even months that it might take to proceed with a creditor by creditor, instrument by instrument negotiation of a standstill. Second, we wanted very strictly to attempt to achieve intercreditor equity. We entirely agree with the IIF that this exercise stands or falls as a joint one, where individual creditors, whether bilateral or commercial, need not worry that they are in effect subsidizing their fellow creditors. So intercreditor equity was one of the hallmarks of what we were trying to achieve. Third, we felt we needed to find a structure that would ensure to the greatest extent possible that the forbearance on interest payments would not connote debt forgiveness, that the interest payments would stand the best chance of being repaid, not this year, but in the not too distant future. So we had the proposal itself is fairly simple. Each participating country, and let me say that not all countries will participate. Some countries are not as afflicted by the COVID-19 situation as others, and other countries may still have market access and would feel that imposing a standstill on existing debt instruments was counter-indicated. But participating countries would direct the interest payments falling due on their existing debt instruments, both commercial and bilateral, to a central credit facility, a CCF. The CCF would be opened and administered by a multilateral development bank. That could be the World Bank, but it could also be the relevant multilateral regional development bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and so forth. That pool of money, representing redirected interest payments, would then be available to be lent to the debtor country for COVID-19 related expenses. The multilateral development bank that is administering the facility will have the responsibility to monitor the use of proceeds. That's a fairly everyday experience for multilateral development banks that do project financing. They lend money against appropriate invoices and so forth. As an interest payment is diverted to the CCF, the creditor concerned would receive a corresponding interest in the CCF exactly equal to the amount of the reinvested interest payment. That interest in the CCF would be tradable, there would be liquidity in it, and the terms of the CCF, while we do not specify what they are, we say generically that the financial terms should be set so that they do not aggravate the post-COVID financial situation of the debtor countries. The G20 term sheet suggests a 4-year stretch out with 1 year of grace. I don't think they specify an interest rate. We don't go into that level of detail, but it is not a long-term stretch out, but it isn't one that would cause an unmanageable hump in payments right after COVID-19 abates, because we don't expect that the world economy will recover that quickly. As payments are made, repayments are made by the debtor country to the multilateral development bank, just as in a syndicated loan, they would be fractured and individual creditors would receive their proportionate share. We think that this could be done quickly. We think that it would be strictly in accordance with intercreditor equity. Everyone would get precisely the same consideration in return for their redirected interest payment. That is an interest in the CCF, so everyone would have exactly the same terms. We also think that the central credit facility would be, should be, recognized as de facto senior in the event that the debtor country, when COVID-19 abates, is faced with the need to do a full-scale debt restructuring. And some of them, I think, will be. But in that debt restructuring, we think the CCF should be recognized as de facto senior. First, it won't be very large. It will be composed of interest accruals for, let's say, a year. It will represent forbearance in the face of a visibly distressed situation. So very much like debtor in possession financing in a corporate insolvency in the United States, very much like the IMF itself, which lends into distressed situations and on that basis claims for itself preferred creditor status. Moreover, it will be administered by a multilateral development bank. We would like to see the multilateral development bank put some of its own funds into the facility. That would be splendid if that were done in a way that thoroughly commingled those funds with the deferred interest payments in the facility. It should bring the CCF within the halo of the preferred creditor status of the multilateral development bank. That would be a wonderful feature. It is not, I repeat, it is not an essential feature. We think that on its own, the CCF would have a very strong claim to de facto seniority in the event that the country concerned had to face a full debt restructuring when this is over.
Thank you very much, Lee and everybody. And what you are seeing, what you saw briefly, was the schematic picture of what this CCL would look like. And essentially the point being that, yes, thank you, Ugo, for sharing it again. I think it is actually useful to show how the different flows and participations would look like, and in particular also clarify how this central credit facility is at the central, yes, under the control of some kind of a World Bank or another multilateral institution, and private sector's participation in the CCF would be actually one of the reasons why they would want to participate in this. So we can now go to, let me just start out the discussion with a few of the questions that have been most often asked these last days to this group, but also beyond this group. And a lot of these questions ultimately have to do with how to organize this. So let me start with the contradiction to a certain extent. There are two principles that should govern the private sector involvement here. And the one is voluntary and the other one is equal treatment among all creditors. So the question would be, if one insists on both of these principles, aren't they mutually exclusive ideas? Because the voluntary participation, meaning everybody on their own terms, wouldn't that immediately lead to differences in intercreditor equity? Can I ask one of our lawyers to respond to this question, Lee or Mitu?
I'll respond, Beatrice. They are mutually exclusive. It's one or the other. If one says that the operation is wholly voluntary, that means that an individual creditor can opt not to participate at all or can participate on terms that are different from those being given to other creditors. So in a sense, and both principles, interestingly, are in the April 9 letter of the IIF, but they are in this degree mutually exclusive. The other meaning one can give to the word voluntary here is that it refers to the commercial creditors as a class, and that the IIF's April 9 letter indicated that the class voluntarily is going to participate and accepts that it will do so on terms comparable to what the bilateral creditors are giving. Having done that, then the question of voluntary participation does not come down to each individual creditor and each individual debt instrument.
So a second question that has been raised from private creditors essentially is that they are facing fiduciary duties towards their own investors. And this might suggest that NPV neutrality may not be sufficient, but that some kind of sweetener may be necessary in order for them to agree to a standstill, be it this collectively or individually. This goes also relates to the question of the implicit seniority of the CCL and the participation in that. But it is a bigger question. So what is anybody on the panel would like to respond to this concern?
So the fiduciary duty argument is an interesting one from a law professor's perspective, because we spend a lot of time in basic corporate law classes talking about fiduciary duty. And the basic idea in fiduciary duty is to give discretion to the corporate manager or discretion to the fund manager in doing what is in the interest of their clients. And from the most basic perspective, if you have a global crisis where what you need to do is to give relief so you can ameliorate that crisis, then that is very consistent with fiduciary duty. Now, this can get complicated. So imagine you have a situation where the official sector says, we're going to give relief. And then you say, the official sector will give relief, and then individual creditors can negotiate whatever relief they want to give on a creditor by creditor basis or creditor group by creditor group basis. So if I'm a creditor and I know everybody else is giving relief, or at least a lot of the others are giving relief, then can I give relief? Well, that complicates my fiduciary obligations, because now I have the option to free ride on everybody else providing relief. So I can understand how fiduciary obligations can get complicated if there isn't some mechanism by which you coordinate everybody in giving equal relief. So that's how I understand the fiduciary issue here. And that now, if you have everything sort of voluntary, each person negotiating their own NPV neutrality according to their own context, it can get complicated. So that's one of the problems to solve.
If you look at this situation and say the choices are either full and timely payment of interest on existing debts or a deferral of those interest payments, for an asset manager, that becomes a relatively easy choice. They would say that my investors always expect me to collect everything that I can, and so if I'm offered full payment, that's the path I'll take. That isn't the choice for many of these countries. It may be for some of them, but it won't be for all of them. For many of them, the choices are going to be a hard default because they simply don't have the money, or they feel that politically, morally, they need to divert that money toward COVID-19 amelioration expenses rather than pay it in debt service. So for a number of these countries, the choice is going to be a hard default, a bespoke negotiation with each creditor for each debt instrument for the terms of a forbearance, something that we think is impractical. It would take weeks or months, precious weeks or months when this relief is needed, and it would produce a welter of inconsistent, incongruous terms for the standstill, violating the principle of equal treatment of creditors. The third option is a unified, consistent, uniform approach which can be implemented quickly. Our proposal falls into that third option. If you restate it, however, in fiduciary terms, and you say, if you're an investment manager, shall I defer payments in that context as an alternative to watching a hard default occur, I think it becomes a much easier question. In a hard default, we're talking about a debt crisis, and the interest payments would fall into that rather large bucket called past due interest. And when the debt restructuring eventually arrives, the treatment of past due interest is often not pleasant. The CCF, we would argue, gives the best chance that the deferred interest will in fact be repaid, not right away, but not in the too distant future. I'll stop there, Beatrice.
Excellent, thank you very much. Maybe one last question in this group of questions that have been asked before, and in the context of how to organize this private sector participation, also has to do with the voluntary nature, but this side on the side of the debtors as well. I mean, the debtor countries have to apply for this, and one of the concerns is that it could lead to rating downgrades. So is it possible that rating downgrades may be, or the fear of rating downgrades may be the reason why none of this may ultimately be implemented? Whoever in the panel wants to respond, please.
Let me jump in here and use some of the language that we have used amongst ourselves in discussing this issue, and say first that getting a debt relief organized without any kind of ratings downgrade is, let me quote here from one of our emails in our exchanges, is a recipe for making an omelet without breaking any eggs. So if you want debt relief, you have to contemplate ratings downgrades. There's no way around it. Having said that, though, why would that be of concern? After all, once you are in a situation as a debtor country that seeks debt relief, you are not going to go out there the next day and try and raise more money, go back to the debt markets. That is going to be for some time in the future. So a rating downgrade is not going to affect you, at least immediately or for a while. And should you want to go back to credit markets, let's say, in 3 or 4 years' time, when the economy is back to normal, when the global economy is back to normal, you might go back probably either after having repaid your interests, if you're able to, that you stayed for a while, or having gone through a debt restructuring. And when those events have occurred, chances are that you're going to, as a debtor country, going to recover the rating that you had lost in the interim period. Credit rating downgrades are obviously to be expected. Some of them have already happened without restructuring, which is even worse than having, or without any debt standstill, which is even worse. should there be further credit rating downgrades as a result of a standstill, shouldn't be a serious consideration for not doing the standstill.
Thank you, Patrick. Ugo, you wanted to add something? I saw you moving.
Yeah, not much more than what Patrick said, but in a sense, the point is that if a country is going to apply for such a standstill, it means that it has problem servicing its debt. So I guess a downgrade was going to be in the air anyway, and after the situation gets better, I think credit rating agencies could have short memory, and as Patrick said, go back to increase the rating of these countries if they understand that was a good reason for this type of restructuring. And we have seen this happening after relatively creditor-friendly restructuring in the past of countries which had restructuring and are back to being investment grade.
Yes, indeed. We have seen this in the past, and without the kind of huge global shock as we are facing right now, which in fact is the reason also for calling this a time not only of extraordinary, but a time of necessity where things become necessary that definitely would not be in normal times. So we have a very active audience who has already provided some questions in advance, and some more in the Q&A. We also have a few people who have raised their hand. I will now hand over to Eric, who has to deal with all these questions and try to, in the remaining time that we have, which fortunately is still quite a bit, deal with them and answer them all. Eric, it's over to you.
Thank you, Beatrice. So indeed, there's been quite traffic in parallel to this very interesting intervention. So I wanted to call first on, I see that we have Jeremy Sedlmeyer here from the IMF, the Deputy Director of the Review Department of the IMF. Could I ask you what is the view of the IMF of private sector participation, non-official sector participation?
So, I mean, the fund doesn't have an official view on the Bolton Committee proposal. I think the fund, views the fact that we have such creative thinking, original thinking, good thinking going on very favorably. At this point, as you know, the fund is focused on trying to make the IDA related G20 debt initiative happening, and as Mitu and others said, this has a private sector component. So we are looking with great interest at ideas on how this private sector component might be made to work. Now, making it work in the way that the G20 imagine is not entirely easy, because as Mitu others highlighted, the presumption, not just on the side of the IIF, but also on the side of the G20, is that this should be voluntary participation. And the reason for that is the feeling that if it is anything else but voluntary, then indeed many countries would fear to approach private creditors for fear of downgrades and loss of reputation, or screwing up the relationship with market lenders effectively. Now, as it turns out, the fear of downgrades is well founded, but it is in fact not even, I think, specific to involuntary approaches, and certainly we would classify the approach of Patrick and Mitu and Lee and co-authors as involuntary, as it involves a unilateral decision of the country to redirect interest to a central credit facility. But virtually any restructuring proposal, except what is called voluntary liability management operations, where you effectively offer debt swaps at market interest rates, and any restructuring proposal will trigger downgrades. So So this is indeed a constraint that probably, if one has really the intention of having the private sector participate in some form, will have to be broken. But at this point, the consensus is still, or our mandate is still, to make something voluntary happen. I should say, there's another element in the proposal, which is a very interesting one, which amounts to a credit enhancement, which is the idea of the CCF. And so on that one, there is also no consensus at this point. So the private sector certainly has been asking for credit enhancements. In fact, the private sector, there are several proposals out there that are asking for much more, say, substantial credit enhancements than is embedded in this particular proposal. And the official sector is a little bit adverse to that. So, the official sector wants voluntary participation, but on the comparable terms of the G20. It is not prepared to offer very much to induce the private sector to come in. And the proposal by Mitu Lee and co-authors offers such an inducement. So I think, the proposal sits a little bit between the stools. I don't think its moment is quite there yet, but its moment may come. And, certainly one way in which the moment may come is if there is a realization both on the side of the G20 that private sector participation is very low, and there's a realization on the side of the debtor countries that, given how things are going, and possibly in the light of downgrades in the past, they do not have very much to lose by asking for private participation. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Maybe I'll hold the responses to that if there are some. There's another perspective perhaps on this, is sort of to what extent this is voluntary, and whether voluntary would work or not. We have Andres Velasco. Can I ask you to come in?
So my question was, as many protesters in Puerto Rico have said, no comemos austeridad. I'm an activist and organizer and researcher that works around many issues relating to Puerto Rico. And, we faced a debt that was relatively unpayable before this. Many states and colonies faced this before COVID. We saw hundreds of schools closed. We saw hospitals closed in the years before COVID. So given the historic health and economic crisis we're facing, the reality that our revenues now and future will fall even further, what is the group's thought on wide-scale debt jubilee, both its necessity and the intense complexities of what that would even look like on an international scale?
Great. So that's, I'll allow one more comment before we get the response. So Andres Velasco.
Thank you very much. My friend Jerome worried that perhaps the proposal is too bold. I want to express misgivings that go in the other direction and ask a couple of questions that suggest that maybe in some dimensions it is not bold enough. And let me begin with something that is very simple, and I'm sure it has a very simple answer. I just don't happen to know it. We've been talking about interest payments, but of course amortizations can be much larger, and it is not altogether clear to me in the scheme that you're proposing what happens to those. Would the amortized money, or the money that is supposed to be repaid, be rolled over automatically? Would it go into the fund, et cetera, et cetera? Secondly, and this is more substantive, I worry about the following kind of thing. Countries in the developing world today don't just have to pay for extra medical personnel or medical expenses or emergency relief. De facto, they have been hit by a massive supply shock, that's the virus, but they've also been hit by a number of other shocks, as commodity prices have collapsed, demand for their exports from the developed world has collapsed, remittances and tourism income is way down. And of course, we're seeing from middle-income countries massive capital outflows. So what these countries will need to do is to run much larger current account deficits. One way of seeing that is, the private sector is running a deficit because its income has gone down, and we're asking the private sector to keep paying wages, so that's a deficit. The public sector will be running a deficit because it has less income and more expenditures. So if both the private sector and the public sector are running a deficit, then the country is running a deficit, and we call that a current account deficit. So most countries don't just need relief when it comes to interest payments, they need new money. And in substantive and sizable terms, we could be talking about current account deficits of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% of GDP. So if I am a country that goes into the scheme that you guys are proposing, I may get the interest payments relief, but I may lose access to the capital market or to any kind of additional financing, unless that is, of course, I am told that the IMF will ride to the rescue and the IMF will provide the missing money, which is not altogether clear. So that's issue number 2. Issue number 3 is that there may be countries, as you pointed out, that feel that they still have access to the capital market and they may choose not to participate. But it is not hard to imagine that there are pretty big negative externalities at work. If I'm a country in Latin America, and forgive me for the location of the example, but that's where I am from, that says I can still tap capital, I do not want to participate here, but suddenly, all the countries in the vicinity are doing that, there's a pretty good chance creditors are going to say, we throw you in with a lot, and you lose access too. So a lot of middle-income countries are looking at these proposals with a fair bit of concern, and you could even say outright skepticism. And I'm wondering how panelists are thinking about that issue, which strikes me as quite delicate. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. For those who don't know this, Andres was a finance minister in Chile during the global financial crisis, so he has some experience of thinking around these issues. Can we? Who on the panel want to respond to these 3 different interventions?
Eric, let me take a stab at some of this. First, on the question of whether the CCF would include principal amortizations and not just interest payments, we debated this extensively. We concluded that it should be limited to interest payments only, although I note the bilateral initiative covers both interest and principal. We concluded that it should be only interest for 3 reasons. The first is that only a subset of eligible countries are going to have principal amortizations during the standstill period. It struck us that those amounts could manageably be the subject of individual negotiations between the debtor and the creditor concerned. Second, again, under the banner of intercreditor equity, we did not want a situation in which creditor A had only 2 coupons in the CCF, but creditor B had 2 coupons plus the entirety of the principal amount of its exposure, that would have deranged the intercreditor equity concern. Third, the de facto seniority of the CCF, something that we think is really quite important and should be quite important for the commercial creditors who are participating in it. The de facto seniority is in a direct but inverse relationship to the size of the CCF. To the extent that the CCF expands considerably, it will dilute its claim to de facto seniority in the event of a full debt restructuring. Why? Because the larger it is, to recognize it as senior means that the terms of debt relief that would have to be asked from the remaining debt stock in a debt restructuring would have to be that much more severe. A small CCF, 1 year's interest accruals, we think would have only a negligible effect in a full-scale debt restructuring. Why don't I stop there and let my colleagues go?
If I can go, I have a small answer to one of the questions of Andrew and Andres as well. So let me start with Andrew. So Andrew asked for are we thinking about a debt jubilee? So this was not our objective at this point, and how we view the situation now is that there is so much uncertainty. There will be, like Lee said, at some point needed to debt restructuring down at some point and proper debt relief, but at this point we don't know which country will need it. If you look at IMF forecast, the IMF has been putting out for many years, 4 or 5 years ahead GDP growth forecast. This year they put 1 year ahead, and for some countries not even that. So there is so much uncertainty that we simply don't know. This is sort of to keep countries alive in all meaning, and then reassess the situation when we have more information. About Andres' comment about possible externalities, I mean, there are two issues here. On the one hand, if some country cannot service the debt and they go into default, you can think that there are similar externalities anyway. So we have seen in the past that our teacher Guillermo Calvo taught us that there is a shock in Russia, and this goes everywhere. So if contagion is still at this level, maybe it will happen anyway. On the positive side, we have seen that in the recent past, markets have been discriminating. So maybe this is less of an issue. While you were talking, I was thinking, you remember the Argentinian finance minister Alberto Weder in the 30s said, we have to pay. If we pay when nobody else pays, we're going to get great reputation, and then we're going to do well forever. Didn't work very well for Argentina, but maybe there is still something positive, in paying when other people have trouble. But that's there.
Anyone wants to come in on the sort of the size of this and
Yeah, Eric, thank you. So I was going to add a word to what Lee and Ugo said. So we are aware that this is potentially a much bigger issue, and we thought, we can't chew at the full thing in one go, and we were deliberately targeting something very precisely, narrowly, that could be done quickly, in fact, immediately. And so that was the purpose of the proposal. So it's not, trying to deny the broader issues that you raised, Andres. Now, coming back to principal payments and the broader context of capital flight, so our position is that even though we're not recommending including principal payments into the CCF, we think it would be inconsistent to set up a CCF to have a standstill on interest payments without also having a standstill more broadly on principal payments due. The difference being that the principal payments due would be stayed, but they wouldn't be included in the CCF. That's what we are recommending. And more broadly, when it comes to capital control, as you said, money is needed, and over and beyond the money available for debt relief. And again, we believe it's inconsistent not to set up capital controls if you're going the route of debt relief.
There are quite a few questions around what is sort of China's role in this. And of course, we know that China has actually insisted on private sector participation at some point. Can I call on Yingfeng Ji? So he says, thanks for the fantastic presentation. I have a question regarding the part of the debt outside the picture, those from China. From what I know, China's development banks are the largest creditor of many developing states. I'm wondering, how can the international debt restructuring address that part of debt? Who wants to say something about this?
So let me maybe chip in here. You know, I don't know actually the full details of the amount of debt that is owed to various Chinese institutions or the Chinese government in the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm not up on all the facts, but to the extent that there are debts, important debts that are raise challenges, servicing challenges for those countries, what the general principles that we have you know, built our proposal around would apply to those debts as well. So you want comprehensive debt relief on comparable terms. And if you say comprehensive, you do want to certainly include the debts that the question mentions. The issue of comprehensiveness, of course, is one, and from my understanding, China has been one of the countries in the G20 asking for private sector involvement, some form of private sector involvement. To the extent that you want comprehensive debt relief, you want all actors involved on comparable terms.
May I supplement that, Eric? I think we have to distinguish between the two phases of this. The immediate phase is the need to get money into the hands of these countries in order to deal with the pandemic. China joined with the G20 in calling upon bilateral creditors to stand still on their interest in principal payments. That was a very significant step. The second phase for some countries will be the need for a more durable debt restructuring when this is over. We went into this crisis with a handful of countries, Lebanon, Argentina, Ecuador, that needed a debt restructuring. We will leave this crisis with a longer list of countries that fall into that category. The question of whether China will participate in a coordinated form of debt restructuring for those countries is a major issue that is not resolved. And it has been with us now for a number of years. China is an observer at the Paris Club, but not a full member of the Paris Club. And that question will come upon us very soon. But for the immediate need, China has joined with the other G20 in calling for a standstill. And as Patrick said, has expressed a view that private creditors should participate on comparable terms.
There's a question from Karen Look saying the lack of transparency around Chinese lending would create a problem in this kind of negotiations, because you don't actually know how much the country is owed and on what terms and so on. Is that something, Lee, maybe you can just follow up on that. How do you see that issue?
That is part of the question. I note that in the G20 communiqué, they call upon any debtor country that seeks this relief to disclose fully the extent of its liabilities. Were China to participate in a coordinated fashion to restructure the debt of emerging market countries, they would presumably have to have a degree of transparency about the circumstances of their loans.
There are quite a few questions also on the issue of to what extent, so we have talked about the specific countries that are affected by the standstill of bilaterals ordered by or agreed by the G20. So these are the poorest countries. Of course, the real debt issues are more in middle income countries, and there are a number of questions here from Turkey, from several countries that are not covered by this particular standstill. How do you see this extending beyond these IDA countries, the poorest countries?
In a sense, this is exactly our proposal, is that, when we talk about low-income countries, it's relatively little money, and it's not so much money owed to private creditor. The big issue is when we move to middle income countries where, you know, if you remember, I don't want to go back to sharing the screen, but if you remember the number I showed before, that's where the trillions are. And not only that, and where the debt owed to private creditor, it's very large. So that was exactly our point, that we need to think about the next step when middle income country where the real money is and where the money owed to private creditor is. And that's where what our proposal is aiming to.
There are quite a few questions on the specific of the CCF. So whether there should be conditionality, whether what is defined as being used to address the impact of the pandemic. Can someone speak on that? There's a, for example, maybe can I call on Mariana Rosales?
Thank you so much. I was hearing to the proposal and it's pretty interesting. However, I have two main concerns. The first one is about what do you understand by COVID relief? Because a country, for example, and we have made large investments in the national health system, which has allowed us to have a pretty good response and not as many expenses as some other countries in medical items. However, the result of the lockdowns and the measures that have been implemented to counter the effect of the pandemic, those are going to be really hurtful for the economy. So I would really like to know if those funds could be also used in, for example, programs, social programs to restart the economy. And in that sense, I was also concerned about the downgrade in the credit rating, because again, one of the tools that usually a state can think about using is investing in infrastructure to restart the economy, to increase the number of jobs. And if for the following 4 years, we're gonna suffer from a credit downgrade, that's gonna make it even more difficult to invest in those kind of projects. Thank you.
First observation, the G20 proposal calls for any participating country to commit to use the money for COVID-19 amelioration expenses. They don't specify what those are. Presumably that's a matter of discussion between the official sector and the countries concerned. Our CCF is a relatively small facility and probably would not generate enough money to be used for much more than direct expenses. But exactly the list of eligible expenses would be something that the Multilateral Development Bank and the country concerned would have to agree on. It is the Multilateral Development Bank then that would be responsible for monitoring the use of proceeds. One criticism we have of trying to do this creditor by creditor, instrument by instrument, is that no commercial creditor or even group of commercial creditors is going to be in a position to do that monitoring and verification of the use of proceeds. Let me say one word on this downgrading situation, because I think it's gotten far more prominence than it really deserves. We are faced with shrieking unknowns. We don't know when this crisis abates. We don't know what the world export markets will look like when it does. We don't know what the financial markets will look like. We don't know what commodity prices will look like. The prospect for many of these countries, not all of them to be sure, but many of them, of being able to go back with free market access in the next couple of years is, to my mind, not all that great. Private investors are going to be skittish for quite a while. Any country that is in a situation that it is likely to need a full debt restructuring when this standstill period ends, that country is facing obviously a downgrade anyway. it shouldn't worry about the prospect now. And as Patrick said, it is unlikely to be being able to go back into the market anytime soon. We are facing a global crisis. There have already been 90 downgrades or changes of outlook since early March. There will be many more before this is over.
There's a question from Christopher Spink on how do rating agencies, how will they treat this CCF? Is that something that's of concern?
The answer is we don't entirely know. The rating agencies apply certain formula that they use, but again, for many of these countries, I think the prospect of a downgrade in ratings should not be all that unsettling. If you look at the rating agency treatment of countries that have gone through full-scale debt restructurings, they put them into a selective default category or equivalent category when the process begins, but they have taken them out of that process pretty quickly after the debt restructuring ends. So the answer is we don't fully know. We would hope a rating agency would view this as a reinvestment of interest payments into a facility that stands a very good chance of getting repaid in full. So one asset is being substituted for another, but rating agencies can be fairly wooden in how they apply their criteria. Again, we're confronted with an exceptional circumstance. And as Patrick says, I don't think we can make this omelet without breaking a couple of eggs.
There's a question from Raffaele Di Marchi. Raffaele's question is about how to treat multilateral creditors. You touched on it in your earlier discussion. Of course, the issue there is that these multilateral credits are benefiting from some of this halo effect that you mentioned, getting preferential creditor treatment. Will this, would including them jeopardize that, or what are the considerations that would be involved in whether to include or not the multilateral creditors, thinking in the multilateral development banks? Who wants to take this question?
Okay, let me take a first pass at this question, Eric. So some people have suggested, we are not among them, that the multilateral debt should be included in debt relief. We have not taken that position. Our position is more that when in a CCF funding by a multilateral is commingled with the interest payments due from private creditors to private creditors, that this commingling does strengthen the seniority status of the payments due on the CCF. That's been our position. Now, as I forget who mentioned earlier in our webinar, someone mentioned that there have been calls in the, I believe it's Jeroen Zettelmeier from the IMF mentioned that there have been calls by the private sector to get much more credit enhancement than what we are proposing in our scheme, such as having the multilaterals guarantee the interest delayed but due in the CCF. We are not advocating that. The simple reason being that any form of guarantee and you probably know that better than we do, Eric, but any form of guarantee on private debt extended by a multilateral is a reduction in its multilateral ability to extend funding. So it's a form of additional constraint on already very limited multilateral funding capacity.
Anyone else want to comment on this?
I'll say only one thing, Eric. There's every sign that the multilaterals are going to be huge net new lenders into this situation. As Beatrice mentioned at the outset, 100 countries or so have asked the IMF for emergency financing. Whatever the multilaterals are likely to be taking out in the form of principal and interest payments during this standstill period, I'm expecting they'll be putting in far, far more than that.
Could we raise a slightly different question? It comes up in a few different questions here on terms of so countries that are already, heavily indebted and maybe some of almost systemic significance. We're thinking maybe Argentina was mentioned as a country. It is very possible that Argentina will possibly default tomorrow. How should these countries be treated in any different way from countries that have sort of up till now not had issues? Is there a sort of, does it matter that some of the things that Argentina goes through now has very little to do with COVID-19?
There are a handful of countries that were at the beginning of this year facing the need for a full-scale debt restructuring. Argentina is one of them. Our CCF proposal is awkwardly suited to try to deal with a full-scale debt restructuring of that kind. It really is more of a temporizing measure designed to get critically needed funding into the hands of afflicted countries during this period of great uncertainty. We openly acknowledge that when the crisis abates, there will be a number of other countries that are probably going to need a full-scale debt restructuring, and that will proceed in 2021 is my assumption. But I don't think the CCF proposal is one that could be adapted to deal with Argentina's immediate situation unless Argentina and a critical mass of its creditors decided that trying to buffalo through a full-scale debt restructuring in light of all the uncertainties that are occasioned by this pandemic is ill-considered, and that the terms of the full-scale debt restructuring should follow some degree of visibility on what the world will look like at the end of this year. Were they to conclude that and decide, therefore, that they needed only a standstill on payments during this period, something like a CCF might be considered, but they're not following that path at the moment.
So I think we are coming to the end of this. Beatrice, did you want to say something at the end? Thank you very much. I think I'm sorry to all those questioners who have not been called on, but there was a very rich range of questions, and thank you for your participation. Please, Beatrice.
Yes, I just want to also thank everybody, first of all our panelists, but then also all our attendees, everybody who asks questions. Is obviously the answers are, we don't have all the answers yet, and this is very much an ongoing issue. The G20 has made a courageous first step, but as Ugo's graphs had very impressively showed, we are talking about a relatively small part of the problem. We are talking about the poorest countries, in that sense the most needed, but the ones where the problem of the coordination with the private sector becomes really striking are, of course, the countries which are larger and which are the emerging markets. If we already get stuck on a debt standstill, which is, after all, a moderate proposal, and I think we have heard on this call also two positions. We have heard those who say, well, this is actually going too far because it is not fully voluntary anymore. And we have also heard the position saying this is not going far enough at all. We would say this is a moderate, it is a centric proposal, it is a feasible one, and most importantly, it is one that can release funds immediately, because we are discussing, to a certain extent, it struck me during this discussion, almost as if we were in a situation where there is a certain academic discussion also about whether that standstill and how to organize it would make sense, and what is the best way of doing it. But as Lee has reminded us several times, this is not the situation. We have a huge cloud above us. We have a huge uncertainty, and there is the absolute possibility of this crisis deepening and becoming much, much worse over the next few months, not over the next years only, but over the next months, and therefore the need to act now, and not the possibility to go for voluntary approaches everywhere and free for all may become still much more evident. Now, this is not something I'm hoping for. Obviously, none of us hopes it. None of us hopes that this necessity will actually become necessary, but it sure looks like it. And therefore we will keep it up. Your questions that we may not have answered, we will continue thinking about them and writing about them, and hopefully meet you again in this and similar types of seminars, webinars. And with this, thank you very much to everybody who joined us today, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.